Hello and welcome to my Humankind Ancient Era tier list for the closed beta. I am going to be taking a look in this series at all the different cultures throughout Humankind that we got to look at in the closed beta, from the Ancient Era, which we're examining today, all the way up through the Industrial Era in later episodes. We'll be keeping the video relatively simple to really focus on having a bit more robust of a discussion about all the different cultures and how well they're balanced against each other. We'll talk a little bit about the different strategies that the different cultures can use, how they might be combined with other cultures in the other eras to have greater effects, or perhaps how they don't work very well in later eras. And I would like to say that just thank you, Amplitude. I've already played about 200 hours between the two open devs and the closed beta, so I've already gotten my money's worth. I'm really happy so far. I think there's still a lot of balancing work to do and a lot of bug work that needs to get done, but it's looking good, and I'm really excited for August. So with that, let's get started. So the first thing to talk about is what defines each tier. So here are the definitions I'm going to use for each tier for the different cultures. So an S tier culture. This is a culture that is excellent all the time. You will never ever regret picking this, and it will excel. And it not only that, but it needs to exceed other cultures in at least one area. The alternative to this is a culture that may be somewhat situational, but when that situation arises, that culture can basically win you the game due to the bonuses that single culture provides. This is going to not come up in this episode, but it may in future episodes. A tier is going to be a culture that is always a good choice, even if it may not be the best choice in every single situation. This is a culture that you'll probably be excited to play, that has consistent good bonuses, but every once in a while there may be a culture that's going to be better suited for your situation. Alternatively, an A tier culture may be one that sort of meets the first part of the S tier definition, but only in specific situations rather than in all situations. So this may be something, for instance, like the Phoenicians, if you have 2 land tiles where you start. Right, the Phoenicians are going to be the only ancient era civilization that can do anything of any substance in that situation. So they would rise to be an A tier or S tier civ in that situation. Now, that might be too specific of a situation. That's just an illustrative example. We'll talk about the Phoenicians more later. A B tier culture is going to be a relatively consistent culture that's a decent choice in most situations, and there may be a few scenarios in which they're not so good. They may be average or below average in certain places. B is still it's still a solid tier. Most of the time, you won't necessarily be excited, but you'll be satisfied to take a B tier culture in most situations. Now, getting down to C is going to be a culture that can do okay when it's given specific circumstances that meet the bonuses that the culture gets, that work well with its different bonuses. But those circumstances are going to be ones that don't necessarily arise very often. So they're bonuses that are relatively inconsistent. Outside of those circumstances, the culture struggles. That is a C tier civilization. Then a D tier culture is going to be one that struggles in pretty much every scenario presented to it, and is probably going to be inferior to either one or all other cultures in the area that it tries to excel in. So, for instance, if you're picking a militarist civ and there's another militarist civ in the era that does every single thing better than the one that you just picked, and the civ you pick doesn't really provide substantial bonuses to anything, that's a D tier culture. And this will come up a couple times. Then a couple things to consider about, what really makes a good culture. And I think these 10 items help sum it up a little bit. There may be others, a few other considerations, but I think these 10 questions are really the core of how well does a culture play. And the first one, and I think one of the most important ones, is how well can the culture generate its primary era stars. So because Humankind is based on its fame mechanic and there isn't another victory condition, being able to generate stars is very important to winning the game. Primary stars are stars that are going to generate you more fame than any of the other stars. So if you are picking a culture that cannot generate stars for its primary era score, you are going to hamstring yourself. That culture needs to excel in other areas in order to make up for its lack of ability to create its primary era stars. The second consideration is how well can the culture generate other era stars. Well, you may say, okay, so maybe this culture doesn't, this, say, merchant culture can't generate gold very well, but it can help my science and my growth and produce this really strong military unit. That's another factor as well. How does this culture enable you to approach all the other things that aren't the culture's primary affinity? The next three are can basically be summed up as how impactful are the culture's emblematic quarter, emblematic unit, and legacy trait. And impact can be defined in a couple different ways. The first and most obvious relation to the original questions is how do they help generate your different era stars? The second part really is how do these impact your ability to play the game? How does it open up different options for you? How does it help you create an advantage over other players? So 6, how well do the culture's bonuses scale into the later eras or combine with other cultures? So one thing that's important to consider when you're picking a culture is this specific bonus going to be useful for me throughout the entire game? Now, there are some bonuses that are extremely powerful in the era that you pick them, but they lose steam the longer the game goes. And there are some other bonuses that do the reverse. So you have to take that into consideration. If the bonus is going to be really powerful in that one era, it can really give you such an edge that you can snowball it into a late game advantage, then it might be worthwhile to pick up if you can take advantage of it. 7 is how strong is the culture relative to the other cultures in the same era? If you have a culture that does stuff, but in each of the things that it does is inferior to other cultures in that same era, it's not a very good culture. You may have some generalists that can do many things, and we'll talk about those as we come across them. But generally speaking, a culture that cannot produce the same amount of whatever output you're interested in, whether it's food, science, whether it's being able to produce strong military units cheaply or effectively, and there's another culture that can do it better, right? You probably want to pick the other culture. The next one is not culture specific. It's how strong is the culture's affinity. So, for instance, there is the agrarian, you have aesthetes, you have merchant cultures, and they all have different abilities. And these are going to impact how you play the game. And finally, how well does the culture take advantage of its affinity? Does it play in to the different things that its affinity can do, its different abilities? Or does the culture kind of counteract those in some ways? Does it have a play style that doesn't make sense given its affinity? So those are all considerations. And finally, before we start, there are a few abbreviations that I may use as we go through this. I'm doing this all in one recording session, so some of these may slip out. So in case you're not familiar, CS is going to be combat strength. This is going to be the combat strength of your military units. And EQ is an emblematic quarter. The EU is emblematic unit. FIMS refers to food, industry, influence, money, science. So these are the core outputs of your civilization. And then STAB is your city stability. I probably won't refer to empire stability, but if I do, I'll make sure to make that clear. Okay, all that in mind, one thing to add before we jump in is that this is a closed beta. A lot is going to change between now and release. There may be significant changes to balance, and the purpose of this discussion is really to think about how these cultures should be balanced against each other going forward. Once the full game releases, I do plan on making a tier list for all the cultures. However, at this point, I don't think anyone has played enough of the game to actually be an expert on this, right? This is all going to be circumstantial, and more importantly, it's all based on specific non-random scenarios. So we're always playing it with the same geography against the same opponents who tend to pick the same cultures. So that's going to have a significant impact on how we perceive each of the cultures. So that in mind, let's push forward. So, ancient era, our first civilization, the Assyrians, an expansionist culture. The Assyrians have this legacy trait where they get +1 land movement speed on their land units. Their emblematic unit, the Assyrian Raiders, and the emblematic quarter, the Dunu. So the Assyrian Raiders are a scout rider replacement, and the Dunu is a garrison replacement. So first, let's talk about the affinity and the legacy traits for the Assyrians. So affinity for Assyrians is expansionists, and expansionists allow you to do two things. The first is they allow you to trespass freely in enemy territory. The second is that as an active ability, you can basically spend gold to have an army convert an enemy outpost to yours. Great, that makes sense. You're an expansionist, you're trying to expand your territory, get more to generate your era stars, capture more cities, increase the FIMS output that you have through conquest. All right, makes sense. Legacy trait, +1 land movement speed on units. This one is kind of interesting. It seems like something that could be really useful, but when you actually experience playing with it, it doesn't really make a difference. Perhaps in much later eras where you're in globe-spanning conflicts, this may be a little more useful. But even then, you can just build, train lines between your cities, and that's going to be much faster, rather than walking everyone halfway across a globe. So this one's a little niche. It can kind of enable you to rush a little faster, and we'll talk about the Assyrian suitability for rushing in just a second. But usually in the ancient era, you're going to be confined to fighting against close neighbors, and +1 movement speed could perhaps get you there a turn faster, but it depends on your proximity. There are a couple niche uses in combat as well, but typically your your melee units are kind of tile blockers, right? They tend to sit in one spot and beat on the other unit until one or the other dies. So the movement speed, in my opinion, is it's an okay bonus given the era we're in. It can have a couple niche applications, but it's not really that good. So, how does it work with the other parts of the civilization? Well, first of all, its unique quarter, or its emblematic quarter, is the Dunu, which is a garrison replacement. Right off the bat, garrison replacements are pretty much universally terrible. And they're particularly terrible in the ancient age, or in the ancient era. The reason for this is because garrisons do not exploit anything. And in the ancient era, what you're really trying to do is build up your output to sustain your civilization in later eras. It's really important to build a solid foundation. Now, the Dunu, it is better than a garrison, so it gets all the stuff that is in the base of the garrison, the plus 10 fortification and plus 1 CS, and then it adds an additional 10 fortification and another plus 1 CS. So it's 20 fortification and plus 2 combat strength total. Okay, great. So what? The Assyrians are an expansionist civ. You are trying to go out and you're trying to conquer other territory. And this is an emblematic quarter that is defensive. It doesn't help you produce military. You can put it somewhere in one of your territories and use it as a unit spawn forward, but you can do that with a normal garrison. So I don't see the purpose of the Dunu. I wouldn't use it ever, unless I'm rushing someone, which you want to do. And if you have a big capital city that's really far away and you need to put a garrison down, yeah, okay, you'll use it, but it doesn't have any real advantage in that situation over just a normal garrison. So Dunu, not very good. So how about the emblematic unit for the Assyrians? Well, the Assyrians have the Assyrian Raiders. So this is a unit that is a cavalry unit. It replaces the Scout Rider. It has 5 combat strength over the Scout Rider, which is pretty good. The Scout Rider is in the very first tier of technology, so you can get this really early if you have access to horses. And the Raiders have the Pillager trait, where they generate additional gold when they're destroying an outpost. Okay, so let's think about this for just a second. I should also mention that the Raiders they cost about double the production of a Scout Rider, so they take twice as long to build. So let's think about this for a second. We have a civilization that is expansionist and has +1 movement on their land units. Then they have an emblematic unit that is a cavalry unit that can pillage. Okay, so clearly the play style here that they're trying to go for is that the Assyrians are like these early raiders that can generate gold when they go out and attack enemy outposts. All right, here's the real problem. The Assyrian raiders' desire to pillage an outpost conflicts with the expansionist active ability, and it conflicts with your ability to generate expansionist era stars. You want to send these raiders out with their really high movement speed, and you want to run around and pillage all of your opponent's different outposts. Okay, great. You get some gold from doing that. You hem in their expansion. But the problem is that you do not have any extra influence generation to plop down a bunch of outposts after you destroy your enemies. So you might be able to do it a few times and have the influence to sustain it, but you can't sustain that sort of playstyle for very long. Furthermore, because you're in the ancient era, you're trying to capture enemy cities. it's really, really important if you pick an expansionist or militarist civ that doesn't have other bonuses to your outputs that you are capturing something from your enemy. Assyrian raiders can't attack over fortifications because they're a cavalry unit. So you are an expansionist civ that has to rely exclusively on base units in order to capture enemy cities, unless you want to sit there and wait for siege equipment and you batter down the walls, and it takes a really long time. And it gives your enemy time to come reinforce their garrison with whatever units that they have. So, all in all, where does that put them? This puts the Assyrians, for me, in the D tier. A very, very strong start for the ancient era. The Assyrians rely on taking enemy territory to subsidize their lack of substantial outputs, right? They don't get any bonuses to growth or industry, money, science, influence. But they also have a unique unit that wants to pillage stuff rather than capture in order to generate some additional gold. And at the same time, they don't have any real bonuses that are going to help them take an opponent's city. So for me, the Assyrians are a civilization or a culture that is not very well designed. A lot of the design choices conflict with what they're actually trying to do. They don't have any bonuses to do what they need to do to set themselves up for later in the game. So Assyrians are D tier. Ancient era, Babylonians. So the Babylonians are quite a switch from the Assyrians. They are the scientist affinity, which lets you take an active ability to turn your cities basically into a science mode. And this converts all your golden production in the city into science. That's fine. There are certain uses for that. It's a little less useful early in the game when you're not going to have a lot of industry or money and you really need to be getting your districts online rather than producing science. But there could be some niche uses for it. The other effect of the scientist affinity is that you're able to research one era ahead of your current era. So for the Babylonians, that means that they can research into the classical era, which does open up a few possibilities. So one of those possibilities, for instance, is the Romans have the Praetorian Guard, which is an extremely powerful melee combat unit in the classical era. But it's pretty far into the tech tree, and it can make it difficult to unlock early enough to really get good use out of. The Babylonians enable you to focus going down the tech tree in order to get to Praetorian Guard early and actually make use of it in a timely manner. So just by having the ability to research an era ahead, that is a pretty decent step up above other cultures. In general, though, I would say the classical era technologies are not as big of a deal as the jump between some of the other eras, but it is a nice little perk for specific strategies that involve some kind of tech rush. So the legacy trait is +2 science per research technology on capital, and then they have the Sebu Sakesti as the emblematic unit, and the astronomy house as the emblematic quarter. So first, the legacy trait. The legacy trait is it's all right. The +2 science per research technologies on capital. So for every, if you have 10 technologies, you're getting 20 science. This seems like a thing that scales okay, but it really doesn't, because the cost of technologies far exceeds the number of technologies as the game progresses. So this is a bonus that is kind of okay in the ancient going into the classical, and then you're not going to notice the effects of it too much as you get into the medieval, pre-modern eras, and tech costs really, really start to go up. It's a nice little boost, and it'll help you research some of the early technologies faster, but don't rely on this trait to boost your science by a ton. Okay, so the astronomy house. The astronomy house is basically a research quarter, except it exploits food, and rather than having the science quarter adjacencies, it gets the +3 science per adjacent farmer's quarter. So let's think about this. What does that mean for your early game? First is that food, aka growth in your cities, as well as science, are two extremely, extremely important outputs in your city at the start of the game. In the open beta, or the closed beta, I should say, in particular, the science has really slowed down quite a bit. So what's happened is the meta has shifted from putting your populations into food into putting them into science. And the reason for that as well is because the pace of growth has slowed, and for some reason farmers don't generate enough food to pay for themselves until you get some infrastructure. So this has created a situation where really science and production are the king at the start of the game. But most of your production you can get from tile exploitation. So your pops are usually going to be in science. The more you can boost your science at the start of the game, the better. But the astronomy house comes with the additional effect of allowing you to get food. Great. Okay. If you are getting 2 for 1 with your emblematic quarter in the ancient era, you're in pretty good shape. It's really important to be able to exploit multiple different yields with one district because it saves you production that you can then put into something else that you need. So overall, decent quarter. The scaling isn't amazing, but it will really help boost your early game. Then next up is the emblematic unit, and I'm not actually sure how to pronounce this, the Cebu Sakesti. It is a spearman replacement, so it has the anti-cavalry, so it's good against mounted enemies. It also has Guardian, which I believe is +3 to your combat strength when you're on a friendly district. So this is obviously a defensive unit, which really, given Babylon's position where they're kind of trying to tech up, it makes a lot of sense. Having this unit that can park itself in a city district and be really hard to dislodge, defend yourself against early aggressors. It does have a few merits in attacking, just based on the fact that it has a higher combat strength than a regular spearman. But it is really a defensive unit. I should also note that it is very good against rushes, particularly someone who is going to be rushing for Hunnic hordes. It may be one of the best units you can get if you're still in the ancient era, because you have the anti-cavalry effect, so if you catch them, you can do quite a bit of damage. And then you have the +3 when you're sitting on one of your own districts. So it allows you to really defend better against the sort of Hunnic horde rush. If you're still in the ancient era, you're trying to collect stars, and someone else has really rushed up to classical to spam out all those hordes. It gives you a defensive tool against that. That's a little bit more of a niche scenario, however. So overall, Babylonians, I place them in the A tier. This is for a few reasons. They're decent at producing science. They're not amazing. They're not amazing at producing science, but they're decent. But at the same time, because of the astronomy house, they are able to save production that they would normally have to invest in agriculture quarters and put them into whatever else that they need, whether it's makers' quarters, units, or something else, infrastructure. This enables them to start snowballing their advantages a little faster. And those little advantages really add up quite quickly. And then in the ancient era, where we've had these increased tech costs over the open devs, the Babylonians are one of the few that can really boost their science output up to levels that are reasonable, such that you're actually progressing your techs alongside your eras, rather than always being an era behind. So this gives you access to things like better infrastructure, better units, all the things that you need in order to continue growing your empire. So overall, good Civ. You're pretty much, always going to enjoy playing it. I can't see a bad situation for the Babylonians. Next up, the Egyptians. They are a builder. So the builder affinity, obviously your primary era stars are going to be building structures, building your quarters. Your affinity allows you to turn on this sort of building mode that converts all your science and money into production. Not very useful in the ancient era because you really need that science and money rather than more production, because you need to be teching up and you're likely to only have one, maybe two cities. So overall, builder affinity power, not very good. The passive ability is that you get plus 10 stability whenever you build a district. Passive stability buffs are not very good. You need things that are permanent. And one of the things you risk with the builder is that you end up sort of going over what I would call your soft district cap, where you're going into 30% stability or below. And you don't want to end up in a situation where you go into the next era and your stability drops off because you were relying on those temporary stability buffs from building districts. It's just not a useful passive. So the Egyptians' legacy trait, they get +1 industry on any district that's producing industry, and they modify the industry district cost by -10%. Okay, so basically you're being incentivized to build makers' quarters. You're trying to get makers' quarters online to get your production up to be able to produce more stuff more quickly. This makes sense. The ability itself is okay. The scaling isn't amazing. You do save a little bit on producing industry quarters, but you might think, oh well, I save 10% of my production, so I can build 10% more quarters. But in reality, you're not just building the makers' quarters, right? So really, you're saving less than that. It's not quite that impactful. +1 industry on a district producing industry, it's okay. By the time you exit Ancients, you might be getting anywhere from +3 to +8, 9, somewhere in that era from this bonus. But most of your industry is going to be coming from exploitations. So it's an okay boost, but it's not incredible by any means. So next up, the Egyptian pyramids. This is probably the best part about the Egyptians. So functionally, it is a maker's quarter. It gives its adjacency to other maker's quarters and all that. The big advantages of it is that the adjacency bonus for the pyramid is triple that of a maker's quarter. So normally when you put a maker's quarter next to another maker's quarter, you're going to get +1 industry. When you put a maker's quarter next to a pyramid, you're going to get +3 industry on the pyramid. So this really helps boost your production up a little bit. And then on top of that, the base industry is higher. And really importantly, actually, it gives you +1 influence. And this doesn't sound like a lot, but in the ancient era, when you're really struggling to come across sources of influence, these small little influence boosts can be very impactful, particularly when you have a few of them. So you're probably going to get 2 to 5 or 6 of these pyramids starting in the ancient era. And over 15 turns, that can accumulate to mean you get to pick an extra civic earlier. You can put down an extra outpost or two earlier, or attach an outpost to one of your cities. And those are very important factors in the early game because influence production is going to be one of the primary things that reins you in from really expanding your empire. Now, the scaling on the pyramid isn't great. Really, you're just looking at these flat bonuses over the regular maker's quarters, but they're okay. It'll help you get your city online for production earlier. Next up is the Markabata, the Egyptian emblematic unit. This is a ranged unit, and I believe is the earliest unit that has the ability to move and fire. So basically, you can move the chariot in, take a shot, move it back out again. It does have a requirement for 1 horse. It's 100 production, which is decently expensive for the ancient era. But it does have actually the highest base combat strength of any unit in the ancient era. Now, that combat strength diminishes when it's in melee, so if it's melee attacked, it doesn't have the highest strength anymore, but the base strength is the highest, and it can actually keep it somewhat relevant going into the classical era. So what do I think about this? This is an interesting one. The Merkabah is unlocked on the wheel, which is a tech that is not a very high priority in your tech order. So that means that you're probably going to be getting it later into the game. And I have had games as the Egyptians where I don't actually even unlock the wheel until I'm in the classical era. There are some potential strategies that involve using this as the core component of a rush. And the Egyptians, because of their bonuses to production, are somewhat competent at producing units. However, they don't have any bonuses to their growth and food output. So they have to be careful to not overextend themselves and drain their cities of population. So overall, it's okay. There are some niche strategies that you can pursue using this. But ranged units, the ancient era ranged units actually fall off pretty fast because there isn't a replacement in the classical era. And these are kind of relevant into that era, and you can do silly things like the Huns where you run in and shoot and run away again and the enemy can't catch you. But it becomes less and less effective as time goes on, and you have to wait until crossbows to upgrade this thing again. So Egyptians overall, I put them in the B tier. So the Egyptians are effective at reaching 3 stars for builders, right? They have the production capacity to get out a bunch of districts. The +10 stability passive, while not useful overall, may be just enough to push you over the edge to get you that extra 1 or 2 districts you need while you sort out your stability. And of course, you can always build some garrisons as well, and those count towards the era stars. And then the Egyptians can also turn that production advantage into a military advantage by producing units more quickly. And with the Markabata, there are some viable rush strategies that you can utilize, and particularly a ranged unit that early in the game with 24 base combat strength that can fire and move. That can get a little silly. There are some ways to deal with it, but it can be a pain for someone who's relying specifically on melee units or non-mobile ranged units. They do struggle a little bit with science. This is primarily because obviously they don't have any significant advantages to science output, but you're really encouraged also to focus on just getting more makers quarters rather than boosting up your growth. So you will have high production, but you're probably not going to have the same level of growth as another civilization that focuses on it, which means you're also going to have fewer populations that you have assigned to science. And it's going to be pretty tempting to put them into production instead of science to speed up how quickly you're building things. So overall, they're a solid choice. Their bonuses aren't insane, but you'll usually be satisfied when you pick the Egyptians. You're not going to be below par when you pick them, pretty much in any situation. And there are a couple different ways to utilize your production creatively in order to advance yourself into the next era. So I think overall that puts the Egyptians at a pretty solid B tier, like right in the middle of B. Next up, the Harappans. They are an agrarian culture in ancient era, obviously. So the agrarian affinity is probably the best affinity in the game for the active ability right now. So the agrarian active ability basically allows you to use influence to steal pops from anyone that is on a border of your cities. And it affects all your cities, not just one. It's really good. It's really good. And this was nerfed from the open dev. So because the reason for this is that pops at the start of the game, you're limited by growth, right? So there are only so many pops you can get and support. So being able to have this ability allows you to grow pretty fast, much faster than other civilizations. The second part is that pops are going to be the primary limiting factor on your military. So when you have a large population, you're able to support more military units. It's really that simple. Third is that pops are your primary source of science output for most of the game, but particularly in the ancient era when you don't have any districts that are actually producing science. And with the high tech costs right now, you really need to be able to put pops into science in order to advance through the tech tree at a reasonable pace. So being able to steal pops from other people for the cost of influence allows you to increase your science. That's the third reason. Agrarian affinity, really good. The passive part, not so much. Basically, it just gives you a small stability boost whenever you increase your population. It's a temporary boost, and it's going to go away if you switch affinities, so don't rely on it. So the Harappan trait, +1 food on a district producing food, and +1 food on a river. So say you settle on a river or several rivers, and you have a whole bunch of tiles around your first city. You're probably going to be able to support an extra pop over someone that doesn't have this. Then on top of that, whenever you're building any food producing district, you're going to get a little bit of extra food. So it helps you sustain a higher level of population. And then when you're losing food and your population is going to sort of decline, it also allows you to sort of weather that decline better, right? You can hold on to a higher than normal population for longer if you really need to push a certain output that your city is producing. The Harappans, because of their abilities with the affinity and the extra food from their legacy trait, it also means that you're able to sacrifice population to produce buildings by more quickly. And it's a really, these all sort of synergize together. So having the extra food, it gives you more pops, and you can steal pops as well to get into your city. The pops produce more outputs, including food, industry, money, science, whatever it is you want to put them in. And then you can also sacrifice those pops in order to build up your infrastructure or your quarters. So it's a feedback loop that plays in on itself, and this will be a consistent theme we'll see for all of the agrarian civilizations throughout all these tier lists. Having more pops is really, really important, and particularly in the ancient era. So extra food is good. Okay, the emblematic quarter, the canal network. So basically, this acts as a farmer's quarter. So you get extra food. It exploits all the food in the neighboring tiles. It also gives +1 food on any neighbor that is producing food. So that's an additional food buff. And the most important effect of the canal network is that it is considered to be a river. What does that mean? It means every single time that you build an infrastructure that affects a river tile, it is also going to affect the canal network. So this is going to include, I believe, a total of an additional +2 food and additional +2 production from building infrastructure that you probably want to build anyway. So overall, the canal network does have a little bit of scaling as you start building infrastructure. Do not build the canal network on an existing river, because then you lose the best part of its benefit. So you want to build this on a tile that is a non-river, and then you can build farmers' quarters adjacent to it in order to collect on that additional food bonus. So canal network, pretty basic. It plays into your affinity to get more pops, to use them in whatever way you see fit. And overall, it's just a really solid quarter for the early era. Next up are runners, which is the emblematic unit for the Harappans. These ones are interesting. So they're a scout replacement. So obviously they're melee. They generate money when collecting curiosities. It's not really important. They do have an upkeep of 0. And when you go from the Neolithic into the Ancient and you pick the Harappans, all of your tribes people are immediately upgraded into the runner rather than the scout. So the scout has a slight CS disadvantage to the runner. The runner is a little bit stronger, just a little bit. So you can do some crazy stuff where you get a ton of population in the Neolithic and use the runners to rush down your opponents. It's an okay strategy. It depends on the situation, how close people are to you, how much growth you could get in the Neolithic. I struggle with this one a little bit because the runner becomes irrelevant so quickly. Basically, as soon as you start seeing warriors or archers, which are in the very first tier of technology, or later on you get spearmen, and you have the sort of the barbarians, the independent people that spawn around, and they'll spawn chariots and that kind of stuff. So the runners become irrelevant very quickly. So basically, the niche for this is a rush, which is very non-synergetic with the rest of the Harappan abilities. However, it does enable a very specific niche strategy that can work quite frequently, more frequently than you might expect. I will point out as well, there is another small niche with the runner, which is that it does have a movement speed advantage over the scouts, which enables it to scout out its surrounding territory a little faster. It has one additional movement speed. So this means you can go meet other civilizations a little bit faster. It means you can get to other territories to claim them a little bit faster. So that's a nice little boost. It allows you to get some trade online a little earlier, scout out your surroundings meet your potential allies or opponents. So overall, runner, you know, it enables a couple things, but it's nothing particularly special. So overall, I put the Harappans in the A tier. Obviously, the runner isn't doing too much here, but really they're in the A tier because of the power of the agrarian ability, combined with the Harappan ability to produce a reasonable amount of growth in the early era. And that growth can be converted into military through pops. It can be converted into infrastructure or quarters by sacrificing those pops once you unlock the stonemasonry tech. And it allows you to produce more science, which you really need at the start of the game. You need more pops so you can produce science. Or, later on, it allows you to get more industry as well. So it's a very simple theory. The only exception to the Harappans being A tier is if you don't have any rivers. If you don't have any rivers, don't pick the Harappans. But so far, what we've seen in both the open devs and the closed beta is that rivers are pretty frequent. You're not going to have too much trouble finding them. So overall, Harappans, great civ, simple, easy to play. I would highly recommend them. Next up, the Hittites. Military affinity. So the militarist affinity is interesting. The active part of it allows you to convert 4 of your pops into whatever your levy unit is. So at the start of the game, that is it's not citizens, but the sort of home guard that you get for free whenever you're under siege. This has some interesting applications, mostly defensive, but you can also use it to migrate population from one city to another. However, in the ancient era, you're more likely to just use those population for military units as a militarist. So more relevant in later eras. Now, the passive part of this is a little bit relevant. So basically, you get a plus 30 to your war supports as a base. And what this allows you to do is you could basically just declare war on someone as soon as you meet them and have a really high war support, even if you don't have any grievances. So this allows for a much more aggressive playstyle. So their legacy traits, +1 combat strength. +1 combat strength. Let's think about that. It doesn't sound very impactful, but I would argue +1 combat strength is the most potent legacy trait in the ancient era. I'll tell you why. When combat occurs in Humankind, the damage calculation is based on the relative combat strength of the 2 units. So a unit that is 20 strength fighting a unit that is 20 strength is going to do the same damage as a unit that is 90 strength fighting a unit that is 90 strength. Each combat strength difference between the units is going to increase the amount of damage you do. Okay, pretty simple. Now you might say, well, it's just +1 combat strength. That it can't make that much of a difference. And you're right. On a single unit basis, it does not make a big difference. But think about the impact of +1 combat strength across an entire army. In the early era, when you may have a single army, or maybe you have 2, say you have 4 units in your single army. That is a total of +4 combat strength across the entire army. Now, if you have 2 armies at full, you have a total of +8 combat strength across the entire army. And as you get later into the game, the armies get bigger and bigger and bigger. And eventually you get to the point where you can easily have 20 to 30 units, even more, in a single combat. So in a combat with 30 units, you are getting a total of plus 30 combat strength as an advantage over your opponents. Incredible. It's incredible. This is an amazing, amazing legacy trait if you want to be aggressive. And the effect of it scales up the longer into the game that you go. All right, let's move on. Talk about the emblematic unit for the Hittites, the emblematic quarter. So the Awari is the Hittite emblematic quarter, and it's not really a quarter as much as it is an outpost upgrade. So this is an outpost that allows a city that is adjacent to it to spawn units on the outpost. That's basically it. It's for rushing. It's for rushing people. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. That's the entire purpose of this thing. Obviously, it doesn't exploit any FIMs or anything like that. As a rush tactic, it's a lot better than what we get as the Assyrians because you get it for free. You don't have to produce it. You don't have to waste your production, building up a district. And then, additionally, you can do this farther out than you can place a garrison. So it has the advantage of being in closer proximity to the enemy because it's in an outpost that isn't attached to your city. And you don't have to produce it. So although it has no real defensive value, it's superior to a garrison in every single way for someone that is trying to rush down an enemy. Okay, that's about all there is to say about the Awari. Obviously, no benefits to exploiting any tiles or anything. So the Hittites are really going to be focused on taking an enemy city and using that to snowball their advantage. So the emblematic unit is I'm not sure how this is pronounced, the Gigir or the Gigir, something like that. So this is a chariot replacement. It has 23 combat strength. Notably, it needs both horse and copper, which can be a little bit difficult to get at the start of the game if you're in a bad situation. It suffers a little bit from the same problem that all the chariots suffer from, in that you get it at the wheel, which is not a high priority tech. You could rush it, but unlike the Egyptian emblematic unit, this is a melee cavalry, so it can't attack into cities. So this is really meant for field battles. Additionally, this unit has suppression, which means when it attacks, whatever it's attacked can either move or shoot/attack on its next turn. It can't do both. So it's a nice ability to have, and it allows the Gigir, I'll call it, to sort of go to the back line and hit enemy archers, for instance, who can then either move away from the danger or stand there and probably just die on the next round. It also has the charge that's innate to heavy cavalry. So when you're charging, you actually have a total of 28 combat strength on this unit because you have 23 base, then you have the it's 27 total combat strength, and then you have the +1 strength from your legacy trait, and then you have +3 from the charge. So 27 combat strength actually puts you up at +1 combat strength over spearmen on Humankind difficulty, which means you can even use these things against their counter if you're going to kill that unit on the same turn. And it also has a use for locking down cavalry, because the primary advantage of cavalry is that they can move a really long distance. But if you suppress them, they either have to move or attack. They can't use both. And you can be a little bit cheeky and use this against like Hunnic hordes or the can't remember the name of it, the Egyptian chariot unit. So it has some uses, but it's not super helpful in sieges. It's okay. I'd rate it below average overall, but there are some situations it can be effective in. So overall, how do the Hittites stack? They have an amazing legacy trait. It's so good, and it's really going to help you out in the later eras. But the emblematic unit is kind of middling. It has some specific uses that it can be really helpful for, but you're probably not going to build more than one. And then the outpost is there to really enable you to rush someone down. So in order to siege a city, you're really going to be relying on your sort of standard units, except your units are all going to have a nice little boost from your legacy traits. So you're going to have that +1 combat strength, and you are definitely going to go for the professional army civic. So between those two, you're going to cancel out the AI's Humankind +2 combat strength advantage. So on even terms, the player is going to be better than the AI. The AI is tactically not very intelligent. So the Hittites, basically, your strategy in the early game is to get a little bit of production and growth in your city, so just enough so that you can support a fairly sizable army of units for the ancient era, and then go beat the hell out of someone. Take their cities, utilize all the stuff that they built up, and use that to propel yourself into the next era. And overall, it can be a pretty effective strategy. There are some caveats to that. There are quite a few units in the ancient era that are quite powerful. If you're facing down the Myceneans, for instance, you are going to have a fair bit of difficulty dealing with the Promakoi, which is their emblematic unit. Similarly with the Babylonians and their upgraded spearmen, they're going to have a higher combat strength than anything you can field. However, against generic troops of the era, you're able to do this quite effectively. But also, because of your emblematic quarter, your outpost replacement, it allows you to get somewhere quite a bit faster, and it's more impactful than the Assyrians +1 movements, because you're getting probably 1 to 2 full turns of movement just by spawning units in a different location. So it enables you to rush faster. It enables you to get somewhere that someone else might not be able to get as fast as you can, and try to capture a city and take some outposts. Overall, it's decently effective. The lack of an emblematic unit that can assault cities really hurts the Hittites in this regard. However, the +1 combat strength legacy trait is really, really good, and I would take it every game if I could, because it's just so impactful. So I'm putting the Hittites in the B tier because there are some reasonable ways in which you can utilize their strengths in order to get yourself an advantage in later eras. And the legacy trait is probably the best scaling trait in the game, at least for the ancient era. Next up, Myceneans. Again, the militarist affinity, so same advantages and disadvantages as the Hittites. Their legacy traits modify units industry cost by -25%, so they can produce their military units faster, and they get extra experience on the units they produce. What's this mean? It means that the ancient era units that the Myceneans produce pretty much always start with +1 veterancy level, which is going to give them all +1 combat strength. Now, someone like the Hittites, they get +1 combat strength without the veterancy, so their cap is higher. The max combat strength the Hittites can achieve is higher if they get to 3 veterancy stars on one of their units, but that's probably not going to happen in the ancient era. So the Myceneans, they have cheaper units, and they have the +1 combat strength that the Hittites give when it comes to your ancient era production, specifically for the Promakoi, which is the emblematic unit. Guys, this one's nuts for a rush civilization. And unlike the Hittites, they have a unit that synergizes really well with it, which we will get into in a moment. First up, though, the emblematic quarter, the Cyclopean Fortress. I've talked enough about garrisons already. They're not particularly useful. This one is a little different from a normal garrison. You go from +1 combat strength to +2 combat strength, and that combat strength applies not just to units in the district, but also to adjacent districts. However, the district fortification is lower, but it increases the fortification of neighboring tiles, and it increases the movement point cost of enemies moving past the fortress. It's a garrison. It costs more than a normal garrison as well to produce. You are probably not going to be building this, except in very, very niche circumstances where you have a big territory and it would take less time to build this and then build your units than to build the units and move them to wherever your target is. All right. The emblematic unit, the Promakoi. The Promakoi is, in my opinion, the best emblematic unit in the Ancient Era. It replaces the Warrior, which is a first-tier technology. It's something you can unlock as the very first technology in the game. The Promakoi has +4 combat strength over a standard Warrior at combat strength of 21, which is, I believe, +1 over a standard Spearman as well. But when it's produced, because it's getting your veterancy, you're getting an additional +1 from veterancy. So really, the base combat strength of a Promakoi is 22 combat strength. Not only that, but on the first turn of combat, this applies on both your turn and the enemy turn, you get an extra +4 combat strength. Oh boy, where do we start with this? The Promakoi is very effective both offensively and defensively. On the offense, because of the champion trait, this allows you to punch a hole in enemy defenses very quickly and get a melee unit into the enemy city where they don't suffer from the drawbacks of fortification. Basically, the champion trait counteracts the defensive, like the barriers and the palisades and all that. It allows you to punch through them as if they weren't there on the first turn, get a unit into the city, and then tear up the levies. Defensively, what this means is that on the first turn of combat, if you are in a city, you are going to take so little damage from whatever is shooting you. And then, if it's a melee unit that's in range of you, you can retaliate and you're going to murder them. Promakoi, really good. You can produce them really early. They're extremely powerful on both offense and defense, effective in rushes, effective against rushes. There's no reason that you wouldn't want Promakoi. All right. So the Myceneans are basically a better version of the Hittites in the Ancient Era. The trait doesn't scale quite as well as the Hittites does, but it's still very impactful throughout the entire game. You're always going to want to produce military. You're always going to want veterancy on your units. It just gives them a combat strength bonus. So, great. The garrison isn't impactful, but really it's the synergy between the Myceneans' ability to produce units faster and the insane strength of the Promakoi that propels them up to an A tier. The Myceneans are going to be the top tier rushing culture in Humankind. They have everything they need to accomplish it effectively. There aren't a lot of civs that can prepare for it very well. And if they do, it means they've sacrificed a lot in order to do it. So Myceneans, A tier. Going to be very effective in pretty much every situation. The only time I wouldn't recommend taking the Myceneans is if you have no neighbors at all, no one you can rush down, like any militarist or expansionist civ. Next up, Nubians. They are a merchant culture. Merchant cultures have changed a lot since the open devs. Merchants used to be really, really good. So let's talk about a couple things here. So we now know the active ability for the merchant culture. Basically, you can spend influence, and you can use that influence to purchase a resource extractor on an unused or on a resource that doesn't have a resource extractor on it already. Or you can kind of do this thing where you like not really upgrade, but you spend it on someone else's resource extractor and it produces some more gold and you get a share of it. Realistically, you're going to use this in the early game to get some of your resource extractors online without having to spend your own money or production. And then you can start trading them away for more money. The passive ability is actually pretty good. It allows you to retrade anything that you've bought from one civilization. So say you buy sage, you purchase it, and then you have an agreement with someone on a different side of the world. You can sell the sage back to them. That helps produce a little more money. It's reasonably effective. It's good. It produces more money, which is what you want. That's why you picked the Nubians. So there are a couple things, however, that are affecting the viability of the Nubians relative to the previous open devs. The first is that the luxury resource spawns seem to have decreased. There aren't as many of them, which means it affects not just your affinity and your ability to trade, it also affects your legacy traits, which gives you the +4 money on luxury resource deposits. So it's a bit of a double whammy for the Nubians. The second part is that your spawn in the closed beta, rather, was adjacent to someone who was a militarist and pretty much always went to war with you. And everyone else was kind of far away, and it took a while to meet them and get trade set up and running. And part of the issue with that was that they often had trade agreements with each other and were trading the resources between each other before you had access to them. So it really diminished the Nubians from being this really strong civilization in every single situation. However, let's talk a little bit more about some of their traits and their unit and quarter specifically. So the legacy trait, +4 money on luxury resource deposit, +4 on strategic resource deposit. Okay, this is fine. A little bit of extra money didn't hurt anyone. It's not crazy powerful. There's a little bit of scaling. If you conquer cities later, you're going to benefit from getting this +4 money on them as the game goes on. But I'd say this is an era appropriate trait. It helps you meet your primary era stars a little bit faster, a little bit better. It helps you maybe purchase a few extra items over the course of the game. It's okay. Next up are the Moreau pyramids. The pyramids, not the Egyptian pyramids, the Moreau pyramids are actually pretty decent. So basically, they exploit production as well as money. There aren't really any money tiles in the game, but there are plenty of production tiles. And one thing that's really good in the Ancient Era, as I've mentioned before, are quarters that give you more bang for your buck, that give you more FIMs when you build them. So although money did take a hit in the closed beta, it's not as powerful as it used to be. Having the Merle pyramids is pretty much the only reliable way to generate some money in the ancient era, which is going to let you meet your primary era stars. And having the Merle pyramids is really what pushes the Nubians into being a decent culture. So you get the +2 industry flat, and you exploit adjacent industry tiles. And most of your industry in the early game is going to come from exploitations. Not only that, you get additional money when you're putting down your maker's quarters, which you are going to be building in the early game. So if you put it next to the pyramids, you're going to be getting +3 money. So say you have a single city with the Merle pyramids, and you have one luxury and one strategic resource. And adjacent to the pyramids, you have 2 maker's quarters. In that situation, you'll get +4 gold from each of your resource deposits for a total of +8. You get +2 money flat on the Merle pyramids, bringing you to +10. And you get +3 from each of those adjacent maker's quarters, bringing you to +16. It's not a crazy yield, but having a few of these pyramids across the 2 cities that you're likely to have in the ancient era, with a couple maker's quarters supported by the different resource deposits, allows you to be one of the very few civs that can reliably get the gold stars in the early game. They're very hard to get at the moment. So it's good. It's good that they can do that. Obviously, you want the primary era fame stars. They're the most important ones for you to get because they give you the most fame, the ones associated with your affinity. However, overall, the value of money has declined because the price to buy things out has increased. So just keep that in mind. You're going to probably be using money to help buy out sort of like the couple last turns of production of something rather than just purchasing things wholesale. However, because the Merle pyramids exploits industry, it helps farther that play style. So it helps you produce things as well as finish the buyout. Tassetti archers. These ones were a little difficult for me. So the Nubians get these Tassetti archers, and the base archer combat strength is 16. The Tassetti are 18. So on Humankind difficulty, archers and Tassetti archers have the same combat strength. So you're basically only canceling out the AI advantage here. They do have the trait exceptional accuracy, so they can shoot above obstacles without penalties. The terrain of Humankind right now does have some fairly frequent obstacles. So this kind of puts the Tassetti archers in a situation where it's kind of dependent on the terrain around them, whether they're useful or not. They don't really have enough combat strength to make them viable into the later eras. 18 is just not strong enough to stand up to things like swordsmen and the classical era emblematic units. They're good for some supporting fire. They'll be a little bit better than archers. They're more effective in a defensive position, like any archer, but it allows you to utilize more of them in unfriendly terrain than a standard archer. How relevant that is very map dependent. That's about the long and short of these guys. There is no resource requirement for them, however, which is a positive. So you'll always be able to build these regardless of situation. So overall, what do we think of the Nubians? I put them in the B tier. I think they're a middle B. They build a solid foundation for a later gold game. However, the gold game has been significantly nerfed from previous versions of the game, where previously I probably would have put them in A tier. I have now brought them down to B. What's really buoying them is that their emblematic quarter is able to exploit production and generate the gold in order to get you the era stars that you need. And then the Nubian pyramids, or the Merle pyramids, with the adjacent makers' quarters that they encourage. You'll probably have decent production, as well as the gold to help rush things out as you need them. That gives you a little bit of an advantage over some of the other cultures that aren't going to have that possibility. So Nubians, middle B tier. All right, Olmecs. The ancient era aesthete culture. So the aesthete abilities are a little strange. So the active ability is a culture bomb. Basically, it instantly converts a territory that you own into your culture. This one is really odd because typically as the aesthete, you're going to be producing more influence than anyone else, which means your culture is always going to be dominant. So there isn't really a lot of reason to ever use this. I feel like the ability should probably be reworked, to be completely honest, because the number of times you're going to be using this ability is pretty much nothing. The passive part of this is, excuse me, I brought a thing up there. The passive part of this is that they get this thing where your cultural proximity is always maxed out. I mean, fine. It doesn't really matter. You're not going to notice the effect of this on your game. So the affinity part of the Olmecs, not very good. However, the important part of the aesthete affinity is that the aesthete era stars are actually really easy to get in the early eras, predominantly due to religion. So it means that the Olmecs can 3-star aesthete pretty easily, and it allows them to push into other eras without building additional stars without feeling as bad about it. So their legacy trait is the +1 influence on territory. This is great. Early game, you're going to be using a lot of influence. You want to use that influence to produce civics. You want to be attaching outposts. You want to be claiming territories. The Olmecs allow you to do all of that better. And as you have more territories, you get more influence. So the Olmecs are kind of the real expansionists of the ancient era. You go out, you peacefully claim a bunch of territories that drive your influence even higher, that allows you to claim even more territories and do more things. So, legacy trait, +1 influence on territory, great for the early era. It has some okay scaling later into the game. A little bit of extra influence didn't hurt. It allows you to claim wonders a little bit faster, and unlock civics a little earlier. So legacy trait, it's okay. It's decent. It allows you to do some stuff that other civilizations can do, but you can do it quite a bit faster. Next is the emblematic quarter, which is the Olmec head. This is think of this as a farmer's quarter that also produces some influence. And that's basically what it is. It exploits food from the tile below it and adjacent tiles. +2 influence as a base, +3 food as a base, and you get extra influence for every adjacent farmer's quarter. This is great. Allows you to grow your city, which, as I talked about before, allows you to increase your other FIMS outputs. So it means you can get more science, more money, more gold, more production. And then on top of that, it gives you what is arguably the most important resource in the early game, the very early game, which is influence, to go out and claim more territories. And then it obviously helps propel you towards your 3 era stars much faster. So, that being said, it's great. I can't argue with anything that produces 2 yields at the start of the game. You're going to be building this every game in pretty much all of your territories because the influence bonus is really impactful and it allows you to do a lot of things a lot faster. I'd also add that the Olmec head it allows you to pick polytheism over shamanism if you don't want to go super hard on the influence. So polytheism gives you a little bit of extra faith instead of extra influence, which allows you to grow your religion faster. So it allows you to perhaps undertake some religious strategies that other people don't have access to and get the tenets a little bit faster so you can have better choices. So it allows a little bit of flexibility as well. All right, javelin throwers. These are an archer replacement. They unlock carpentry, which is one of the very first texts you can research. 20 strength. It has the ambusher trait, so on difficult terrain tiles, it's a little bit stronger. I believe the range of this was reduced to 2 rather than 3, and it hasn't been updated yet. Don't take me on that for 100%. But if that's the case, there is the disadvantage here over archers where you can't have as many of these units supporting you at one time as archers do, even if you do have that extra combat strength. So what this unit really excels at is getting into a position where there's difficult terrain, you're in high ground above the enemy, and you want to shoot down onto them to do a ton of damage. That's what this unit's good for. It's decent in city defense as well, trying to take out melee units and such. It's an okay support unit. 20 combat strength scales a little bit better than the Tassetti archers into the classical era, but once people start getting their emblematic units in classical, these javelin throwers aren't going to be particularly effective anymore. You're largely going to be relying on melee units. So scaling is okay, effective in early classical, but as it goes on, you're not going to be getting as much use out of these, particularly because of the range issue. The other advantage, perhaps, is that a little bit of extra combat strength does help you plink down siege defenders in case you're trying to attack someone as the Olmecs. But honestly, as the Olmecs, you're probably just going to be focused on expanding your territories through claiming outposts. So it is possible to do that. Javelin throwers have enough combat strength that they can do a decent amount of damage to defenders, but there are better cultures for trying to rush someone. So overall, I put the Olmecs in the A tier, and this is almost entirely due to their ability to produce influence relative to the other cultures, as well as the ability of that influence to enable a lot of different things, specifically expanding your territory. So the Olmecs can run around, they can claim all kinds of territory in the early game, they can unlock civics earlier, they can claim wonders, they can attach their outposts, and when you attach outposts, you get the benefits of the surrounding tiles of that outpost on the city you attached it to, which increases your production and your food. And then the emblematic quarter allows you to increase both your influence and your food, which helps you have a bigger population and do all these other things that I already talked about. So Olmecs, overall, really good culture. I wouldn't put them in the S tier. There are other cultures here that can do other things extremely well as well. But overall, my experience with Olmecs in the closed beta was that they were mostly on par with the other civilizations that I also put in the A tier. So next up, Phoenicians. So culture that focuses on the merchant affinity. So same advantages and disadvantages as the Nubians. For the merchant affinity, with being able to use influence to buy a resource extractor, as well as retrading goods that you traded from another culture. Legacy traits. Modify all constructibles buyout costs by minus 20%. And you might look at this and think, wow, that's incredible. That's so good. It is. It is. It scales really well. taking 20% off the cost of all your units and infrastructure and quarters is really strong, and it has the ability to snowball later in the game. The problem is that the Phoenicians do not have a strong ability to take advantage of the legacy trait in the era in which they get it. The Phoenicians are a bet that later in the game you can generate enough money that you can abuse the legacy trait to make a bunch of stuff. And in my opinion, a culture that has a trait that is not able to be utilized in that era effectively is not a very good trait. And we'll get into how this interacts with their other abilities as well. So the buyout cost, great scaling, amazing. It's really good. Buying stuff for cheaper, and you can combo this with the Dutch, you can combo this with the Ghanaians, and you're making a ton of money. And the obvious combination is the Carthaginians with the minus 50% gold buyout cost. But if you combo with the Carthaginians for that minus 70% buyout, the Phoenician haven is only mediocre at producing gold. And the Carthaginians have no additional ways to produce gold, even though they're a merchant's culture. So you are hamstringing yourself until the medieval era to really ramp up your gold production. So yes, it can be effective later in the game. Yes, it can have significant impacts, but it is going to take a long time to come online. And the early era of the game is the most important era because you are laying the foundation of your future empire. You need to be building up your cities and tooling them to whatever your strategy is going to be for the game. So, the Haven. At first pass, the Haven actually seems really good, right? So you look at the Haven, you get all the benefits of the harbor where they're producing food. Then you also get +2 money on the adjacent coastal waters, +2 money per adjacent lake, and an extra trader slot. Okay. The issue with this, the issue with the Haven, is that it unlocks at a technology that is very low priority. It takes some time to unlock that technology because it's in the second tier of technologies, so you need to invest heavily in science. The Haven itself, because it's a harbor, is the highest production cost quarter in the game, as far as general quarters go. So it takes longer to produce it. That all being said, it means that you are sacrificing your technology to rush to get to the Haven in order to get your gold income. It means that you don't have access to all the other great benefits some of the other technologies provide for growth and military specifically. It means that you are utilizing your production for longer to build something that has less impact, specifically money, than growth and industry. However, the Haven does provide growth, being a harbor. I will add that. Though perhaps you would be better off building a farmer's quarter. So, that being said, what do we think about the Haven? Basically, it takes too long to get online. It is too late into the era that you're not able to utilize it effectively. And as the Phoenicians, you are going to struggle to actually get your merchant era stars because of how long it's going to take you to get the Haven. So this is compounded by the fact that in the closed beta, the coastal waters were really broken up. If you look at the map of the closed beta, there are a lot of areas along the coast where it's actually deep water rather than coastal water. So it made it really situational where you could actually place havens effectively to make full use of their ability to generate money. And we know that the developers were asking for feedback on the terrain generation in the last open dev. So we don't know how representative this is going to be of the final game when it releases. But in the beta, at the very least, the way the terrain generated made the haven even less useful than it already was because you couldn't reliably get it in all your territories. So the haven, in theory, great. In practice, way too hard to actually get going. Emblematic unit, the Bireme. So the Bireme, it's a slightly stronger Pentaconter with additional +1 CS. And the more important part is that it has Navigator. So instead of just being destroyed in deep water, it gets damaged, so it allows you to explore over deep water. So that's kind of unique. It's kind of interesting. The practical benefits of this might be somewhat limited. There are a few situations where traveling over deep water is practical. You are not going to manage to make it across a large ocean with this thing. It's going to be a little more limited in scope. But there are some situations you can take advantage of this. However, having a ship as an emblematic unit overall is just not very good. You want a land emblematic unit, specifically in the ancient era when there are really quite a few dangerous units running around, and you're likely to be subject to a rush by another enemy civilization. So overall, has a couple unique abilities, specifically on exploration and perhaps expansion, but overall, in most situations, not very good. So Phoenicians, overall, C tier. And I place them above the Assyrians specifically because of the minus 20% buyout cost, and the haven is at least useful, unlike the emblematic quarter for the Assyrians. So the Phoenicians, if you can survive, can at least help you scale fairly well later into the game if you go for a money-based strategy. However, they don't get a lot to help them really get going. And again, a lot of that issue is related to the haven. But if you can, say, pick the Carthaginians, and then pick the Ghanaians, and then pick the Dutch with the VOC warehouse, where you're getting the adjacency bonus from all your different harbors that are collected together, you can get some crazy buyouts going. But you're going to be sacrificing the early era fame stars, so you have to be really confident that your strategy is going to pay off in the long run. Whereas other cultures of this era are going to benefit you both in the short term by helping you build your foundation, and in the long term by having some benefits that scale and having a stronger foundation on which you're advancing into farther eras. So the Phoenicians are a C tier for this closed beta, rather. Finally, we come to the Zhou. The Zhou are an aesthete that comes with all the baggage of the aesthete affinity bonuses. But again, it's good for the era stars because the era stars are easy to generate. And that's really important for the Zhou because the Zhou don't have any ways to generate influence specifically for them. So they'll take shamanism. You can take the civic that gives you the +5 influence on city centers, and you can almost always get 3 stars in aesthete just by taking that route. Their legacy trait, the +2 stability. So in the open dev, this didn't seem very impactful, and for good reason, right? In the open dev, for one, the AI wasn't very good, and you could claim pretty much all the wonders, and that would really boost your stability up. The Commons quarters were much better than they are in the closed beta, providing like a flat +10 stability, and now it's just +2 stability for the adjacent quarters. And the holy sites used to provide double the stability that they do now. So overall, it was really easy to maintain high stability in the previous open devs. That's not the case anymore. So the Zhou, with +2 stability on district, it's like you have a commons quarter adjacent to all your districts. So say you have 10 districts as the Zhou. It means that you are going to be at a -80 stability from that, rather than -100 from any other culture. So what this enables you to do effectively is build 20% more districts to support 20% more districts than you could with other cultures. And this helps get out some extra districts at the start of the game. You don't have to worry about the stability as much. Or it allows you to move around on the sliders a bit on the civics to get some extra early game bonuses that can help your game. Specifically, there's one that gives you a little bit of extra influence on territories that can be really useful for the Zhou when they're trying to 3-star aesthete, as well as excuse me, as well as providing some extra bonuses to things that already provide extra stability. So a garrison, instead of providing +5 base, provides +7, or once you have the infrastructure, instead of +10, it provides +12. Personally, in my experience, in the games I actually played these guys, the Zhou were the only culture pick that enabled me to actually have high stability on my entire empire for a fairly sizable portion of the game. Most of the other cultures, I was really struggling to keep it above 30 in a lot of my different cities. But the Zhou really have this unique ability to keep high stability in a lot of their cities. Next up, the Confucian School. This is their emblematic quarter. It acts as a research quarter. Okay, that's great. Exploit science. It doesn't matter too much. It does have +3 stability. So with the Zhou, it's really +5 stability. So that's half a district that this can support. Has a flat +1 science. Not that exciting. Here's the real kicker for the Confucian School. The +5 science per adjacent mountain. Okay, this is a adjacency bonus that is very, very situational. But when it is applicable, it is really, really good. So for reference, a single scientist in the early game of Humankind produces +6 science. The Confucian School, if there is a single mountain, will produce as much science as a single researcher. Okay, that's not very impressive. But what if you had 5 adjacent mountains? Or even 4 adjacent mountains? It's really good. So if you have 4 adjacent mountains, you are producing 21 science on a single district in the ancient era. So the Confucian School in that situation is the equivalent of 3.5 population as a researcher. It's really good. This has several effects. If you are trying to pursue multiple things at once, you can switch your researchers off into production or growth or money if you're trying to pursue those things for whatever reason. And if you were really focusing on science, which I suggest you do with the Zhou, then it really propels you above some of the other cultures. You can have much better science output as the Zhou than you can as the Babylonians because of the Confucian School. But it has to be in the right situations. the other thing to this is that the Confucian school is probably something you're not going to be building in every single territory. You're only going to build it in, say, two, maybe three or four, depending on how lucky you get with the terrain. However, if you have, as long as you have two spots where you have, say, three, maybe four adjacent mountains, it's worth it. This Confucian school is providing you a massive benefit just from having a couple of them. And that means that instead of spamming your emblematic quarter, you can actually spend your production on something else instead that's going to help you continue to build up your cities. So you just put a couple of these down in the appropriate spots. You get your plus 50, plus 60 science, which is enormous in the ancient era. And then you just go off and you build your units, or you build maker's quarters or agriculture quarters or whatever it is that you want to pursue. So again, situational, but in the situations that it occurs, it's really strong. And it allows you to just build a few of these things rather than spamming a quarter in every single territory that you have, that you often feel like you have to do with the other cultures. Finally, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, the Janash or something along those lines. This is another chariot replacement. It has an extra +1 combat strength over the chariot, and like the chariot, it requires horses and copper, just one of each. And it has this ability called Mandate of Heaven, which gives a bonus combat strength when stability is high. Yeah, it's a chariot, so it's mostly good for field battles. The real issue with this, though, is that with Mandate of Heaven, the early game is the part of the game as the Zhou that you're going to struggle the most with stability, as with many other cultures, because at the start of the game, you're going to be producing a lot of districts. So you're most of the time not going to be getting the bonus from Mandate of Heaven. So effectively, this is a +1 combat strength chariot. It's not very good. All right, so ranking the Zhou. The Zhou are a little bit hard because they're so situational. So if you don't have mountains, you don't pick the Zhou. If you have a lot of mountains, they can be a really, really good pick if you're going for a strong science game at the start. So I place them in the B tier because they're not particularly versatile. However, in the games where certain conditions are met, specifically around their emblematic quarter, they can be just as good as the other A tier civilizations. And the +2 stability, while it used to be not as impactful in the open devs, is actually quite impactful throughout the entire game. So the Zhou, decent pick overall, situational, but it's something that you can really excel with in the right situation. So this is the final tier list. You will see that there's a pretty tight cluster around A and B in the ancient era, which in my opinion is where culture should be. S tier is not healthy for the game, and neither are C and specifically D tier. I think that the ancient era is probably the most balanced era in the game in terms of comparing the cultures to each other. They have a lot of different things that they can do, but none excels so much that you want to pick them every single time that you play the game. If I had to pick the best culture, I would say I would tend towards the Harappans, just because having more population is the most versatile thing that you can have in your city, so it allows you to really pursue any strategy that you want. But I would say both the Olmecs and, interestingly, the Myceneans could probably compete for that spot as well. I think the Babylonians are more of a middle to low A, whereas the other three are like a high A. So those are my thoughts on where I would place all the cultures in these tiers. And I look forward to providing you guys with some more content later, thinking about the different cultures in the classical era next time. And I'd just like to say that I am really, really looking forward to Humankind and producing some more content for everyone. So I will see you all next time. I hope you enjoyed.